It took me some time to learn how to read as a child. It was something I struggled with when I was very small. And it wasn't until I was perhaps about 7 years old that I really got it and began to read more fluently. And I remember one of the very first books I read after the primary readers was Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. And that book has stayed with me. I have these fragmented images in my mind, which in actuality probably bear very little relationship to what the book actually is, since I was 7 years old. But I think that was the book that made me love books. I think I'm just not particularly drawn to realism as a writer, which sounds terrible. I don't mean to suggest that I'm writing fantasy or magic realism, but I've had other people comment on this book and on other books that there's almost a science fiction feel, which is not intentional. It seems to just be the way I write at this point. I think this goes back a little bit to why I didn't want to approach this, from the standpoint of, say, gritty realism. And there are, of course, themes in the book that would be quite brutal, and that perhaps are brutal in the book, but would be more so if they were approached in a very realistic way, like child abuse, kidnapping, etc. I felt like there was something more subtle and perhaps more effective about approaching these issues kind of in a slightly roundabout fashion. And I think about that wonderful line in the Chekhov play, The Seagull, when there's a discussion of a writer's work, and a somewhat mediocre writer is comparing himself to a better one. He talks about how when he describes moonlight, it's sweeps of moonlit plains and valleys and light and shadows and romance. And when this other writer describes it, he describes the glint of moonlight in a broken bottle. And that's what I aspire to. I'd like to give you shards of broken glass in the snow rather than hitting you over the head, so to speak, with a more brutal way of expressing the same thing. I had an idea as I began writing it, as I began deciding what the structure was going to be, that it might be more interesting and perhaps more effective to build the book rather from the perspective of which event came first and going forward in a linear fashion, to try instead to move toward the moments of the most drama, for the sake of the arc of the book. So it seemed to me that if you have a couple of moments, perhaps even if they're 10 years apart in time, in the linear world of the book, that there was no reason not to build up to both of those at once and bring all of the most fraught moments together at the book's climax. It just seemed to me that might be an interesting way of structuring the story.